Are you one of those people that think the first production Firebird was built for the 1967 model year? Well, if you are, you're wrong. Well, that's because this car right here, the Alvis Firebird, beat Pontiac to the name by more than 3 decades. Now, what's an Alvis, you say? I'm glad you asked. Hi there, I'm Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution. And once again, I'm here at the Martin Auto Museum in Phoenix. You know, as I've often mentioned, this is a great collection with more than 180 cars. And while the majority are American iron, we do have some interesting foreign cars like this 1936 Alvis. And you'll be forgiven if you've never heard of Alvis. They built cars starting in 1919. And the automakers survived all the way through the mid-60s. They occupied a unique spot in the British automotive world. You know, they weren't built in big numbers like Morris or Austin. They weren't as luxurious as Rolls-Royce. And they weren't as sporty as, Aston Martin or Bentley. Now, Alvis had a unique spot right in the center of all that. They had advanced engineering, and they were stylish if understated designs. At one point, their advertisements read, "The thrill of performance, the satisfaction of quality." But before we dive too deep into this particular car, make sure you like and you subscribe. And in the comments below, let me know what I got right. And of course, let me know what I got wrong. There's always something. For example, were there other production Firebirds from other car companies? To be honest with you, I couldn't find any, but you might know of some. And since you've likely never owned an Alvis, let's talk about the British sports cars that you have owned. For example, my very first car was a 1959 Austin Healey Bug-Eye Sprite, a fun little car that was basically an oversized go-kart. All right, let's get back to this Alvis Firebird. And we need to start by talking about the history of Alvis. The company was founded in Coventry, England in 1919 by a gentleman named Thomas George John. Alvis quickly earned a reputation for engineering rather than flashy styling. While many manufacturers relied on proven mechanical designs, Alvis continually experimented with new ideas. The company became known for things like independent front suspension, all synchromesh transmissions and gearboxes, and very sophisticated engine development long before many competitors adopted similar features. Its early models, like the 1030 and the 1250, earned a reputation for both reliability and spirited performance. They appealed to drivers who valued engineering excellence. They even invented a name to describe their special place in the automotive industry. They called it Alvivicity. At least I think that's how they pronounced it. Through the early 1930s, Alvis refined its identity as a maker of gentlemen's cars, vehicles that balance performance, craftsmanship, and understated luxury. They were sporty, but practical, elegant without excess. Models like the Speed 20 and the Speed 25 showcased the firm's engineering prowess and attention to detail, while its smaller cars offered accessible refinement. By 1935, Alvis had firmly established itself as a respected mark in British motoring. It was setting the stage for the introduction of this car right here, the Firebird. It was a car that embodied the company's philosophy of precision, grace, and mechanical integrity. Its tagline in ads was swift, silent, certain. The Firebird was actually the entry-level Alvis back in 1936. You could also get a Silver Eagle. There was a Speed 20 SB, and the top of the line, the Speed 25. Those were all bigger and more powerful. But while you weren't spending as much for the Firebird, you were still getting the same technology, like the independent front suspension, the 4-wheel hydraulic brakes, and a synchromesh 4-speed transmission. Let's walk around and take a closer look at our 1936 Alvis. Of course, we'll start with that beautiful Alvis logo on the front, the upside-down triangle with the Alvis name in the center. It's important to point out that while Alvis did all of the mechanical construction for this car, the frame, the engine, the steering components, they didn't actually build the bodies. For that, the work was farmed out. There were 2 companies in particular that built the bodies for Alvises back in those days. One was called Cross and Ellis. The other was Holbrook. This particular car happens to be a Cross and Ellis body. They're very difficult to tell apart from my perspective. The Cross and Ellis has a slightly more upright windshield. It's got a very roomy passenger compartment, high quality fit and finish. My understanding is that the Holbrook bodies were just a little more stylish. But the bottom line is This was built by Cross and Ellis, not by Alvis. Cross and Ellis very closely associated with Alvis, but once again, it was a different company that was actually building these. Now, you could get several different body variations. This one is called a drop head coupe. And the obvious reason being is that it's a convertible that pulls back like this, and as a result, they call it a drop head. Very common name for convertibles back in those days. In addition to the drop head coupe, you could also get a four-seater drop head, four-seater convertible. That had an extra door back here. It was a longer chassis and the convertible top that would go back. They also made a four-door saloon car. That was actually the most popular. This was the second most popular of the body styles that they made. And what's interesting about our car right here, this particular car that was built in 1936 or sold in 1936, looking at the serial number, I believe this was the fourth to the last car that was ever built by Alvis for the Firebird series. And I believe it was actually the second to the last car that was actually sold and actually left the factory. But of course, it's got that classic styling of the 1930s. One of the things that they did between this car and the previous car was called the Firefly. It had basically a flat grille. For the Firebird, they made it come out with a kind of a bigger peak right there. Now, it's important to point out that this really was the bottom of the line model. I'll talk more about the other models that were available in just a moment, but this was the entry level Alvis that you could get back in 1936. I love these things right here, whether you call them trafficators or semaphores. These are the turn signals. They would pop out to tell people when you were turning. So a great look. Of course, it's got this great suicide style door. We'll go inside in just a moment. We see how it works. This is that slightly more upright windshield I was talking about. And boy, this just looks luxurious for its day. The idea of having this beautiful mounted tire. And I'll tell you, the one we have here at the museum is just really nicely done. Restored somewhere quite a few years ago, but still looks very good. I love the fact that they've got these twin windshield wipers with this unit in between that allows them to rotate together. But overall, once again, a great looking cars. You know, this Cross and Ellis bodywork, that was very common back in those days. If you were a specialty car maker, the idea was that you'd go to a different company that had the ability to build the coachwork while you were concentrating on the mechanicals, and that's exactly what they did with this Alvis Firebird from 1936. Well, lifting the bonnet of our 1936 Alvis, we find the classic 1842cc four-cylinder engine. Now, this motor represented a steady refinement by Alvis engineers. And the first thing I need to point out is this has an overhead valve engine. In fact, Alvis had been using overhead valves since the mid-20s. It was a perfect example of how they used engineering to try to gain an advantage. It also had a cross-flow layout that improved engine breathing. And the result gave them an engine that made between 55 and 60 horsepower, which was pretty solid performance for a four-cylinder motor. These engines were also carefully balanced, so they ran unusually smoothly for a four-cylinder. As I mentioned earlier, there were three other Alvis models that were available back then. There was the Silver Eagle that had a 2.1-liter inline six that made 70 horsepower. The Speed 20 was a 2.5-liter that was good for about 90 horses. And then there was the Speed 25. That had a 3.5-liter inline six that delivered 105 horsepower with a top speed of about 100 miles an hour. But back to this Firebird. Once again, this engine was a good middle ground for Alvis compared to other British cars. MG engines, for example, were sportier, but they could feel less refined on long journeys. Austin and Morris had cheaper engines, so there was less performance. And then there was Riley. That company had a twin cam that had great performance, but it was trickier. It needed more maintenance. This Alvis engine was not intended to be the most powerful four-cylinder in Britain. Instead, it was designed to provide an ideal balance of smoothness, reliability, and efficiency. Inside, the Alvis is a classic British 1930s car. The dash itself here in the Alvis is similar to the car that was the Silver Eagle. The Speed 20, though, well, that had a more stylish dash with the instruments tucked a little bit more under the wood and bigger gauges. But the Speed 25, that was the top of the range. That had more luxury, nicer dash, gauges spread all the way across. Getting in here is a little bit awkward because the emergency brake, the parking brake, is on the right-hand side, so you have to get your feet over it. And once you do, once you're inside, you're greeted with something very unique, at least in my mind. It has 3 pedals, but they're not in the same position you're used to. In this case, the center pedal is your throttle, the accelerator. I'm assuming the pedal on the right is the brake, and the pedal on the left is the clutch. But a 3-pedal setup with the accelerator right in the center. So 3 pedals, we're used to that. You could adapt to it pretty quickly, I'm sure, if you were used to our regular setup. As I mentioned, this car has a 4-speed synchronous transmission, which, for that era was pretty impressive in terms of what you were able to get and what it was able to do. The fact that the synchronous transmission just made shifting just a little bit more smooth. I will say inside, boy, this is a nice car. You can tell this is an upscale type car. Not a Rolls Royce, of course, but in terms of the seats themselves, they're big, they're bolstered, they're comfortable, they wrap around you, so you've got a nice, definite, feel to them. The gauges, once again, it's kind of awkward back in those days, the fact that they were here in the center as opposed to right in front of you. But, looking through this massive steering wheel, it's pretty easy to see both your speedometer, your tachometer. Here's where you've got your starter, which was a push-button starter. Rotax was a company that was building electronics for cars back in these days. I think it was ultimately absorbed into Lucas. But for example, if you look on the headlights here, they have the Rotax name on the back. I can't put the convertible top down right now. I imagine it's pretty nice looking, but I will say this is one of those cars that I think looks really attractive with the top up. Technically, this is a 4-seater. It's a coupe, 2-door, but 4-seater. But the back seat, I tell you what, it's really nice. Not a lot of leg room back there, but in terms of comfort, I think they did a nice job with it. I'm also intrigued by this little ashtray right here. The fact that what you do is you would lay your cigarette long ways across here, and then it's got a little slot right here that you could use to, the ashes would drop through, and then of course you could clean it out by pulling it out. And it actually has a cigarette lighter right there. A big, huge steering wheel, as I mentioned, because back then you didn't have power steering. And it's still at that point when we're crossing over between the old style and the new style in terms of how the engine is controlled. Yes, you've got the pedals down below, but you also have these controls up here, the ignition and the throttle. So you could hand control the throttle. In many ways, it was like a cruise control back in those days. You could advance or retard the ignition so it could run a little bit smoother. And they also had the light switches up here for all lamps, headlamps. You could dip the headlamps, and that was all right here. Love the beauty of the dash, though. I mean, take a look at this with this burled wood, really nicely done. Once again, this was designed. It's not a Rolls Royce. It's not an all-out luxury car, but it is a car that's designed to be a step above. I like the fact that the wood goes into the door down the side as well. This is kind of intriguing right here. This one little pillar that sits up right here that is the frame for the window, matches perfectly into here. I imagine that would get broken off a lot if you weren't careful, and who knows whether people were going to continue on with that, but kind of an intriguing styling design. And we joke these cars back then did have air conditioning. The way you would air condition it is you take this window and you would just pop it out, and that would allow the air to come in. This also, though, does have a small vent right here, so you could open that up, allow the air to come into the car, or close it down if it was a nice cold day, which I'm sure there were plenty of back in Britain in those days. But once again, nice, upscale, comfortable, big, huge, comfortable steering wheel, everything you pretty much were going to want in an upscale car. So I think the Alvis was achieving its goal. Didn't want to be too high, but it was a long way from being, something simple and basic. It's estimated that about 450 Firebirds were built, which means that even when new, these were not a common sight on the British roads. Best guess is maybe 80 to 100 survive today, and this is likely one of the few that are still around in the United States. Alvis managed to survive both World War II and the booming 50s. They built impressive cars like the Alvis TC Gray Lady and the Alvis TD21. But in 1965, Alvis was acquired by Rover, and in 1967, the company built its final automobile. It then moved on, though, to making military vehicles, which continued through 2004. Today, the Alvis Car Company has been reborn with a continuation series of cars based on the classic Alvis designs. What Alvis did so well for so long was maintain balance. Their cars had just the right combination of performance, ride quality, and reliability. They never dominated racing. They didn't have massive production numbers. What they had was a careful refinement of each and every mechanical detail to create a car that always exceeded expectations.